Hi, and welcome back to Dog Speak. Today we have the wonderful Tracey McLennan, who is one of the best in the business in her field of working with high prey drive dogs. I am going to let Tracy introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. So lovely to be here. I specialise in high pre-drive dogs. I have been living with dogs with high pre-drives for over 20 years now. I focused on it when I studied for a master's degree in applied animal behaviour and training. I focused on pre-driving dogs. Because there's not all that much research out there about them, that was one of the reasons, and I'm really fascinated by the subject. I had my research published in the journal Applied Animal Behaviour Science, and I now peer review for that journal if they have articles that are upcoming about pre-driving dogs. So I've got loads of experience of living with those dogs. I also, my whole work is dedicated to helping people who've got a dog with a high pre-drive and who don't know what to do about it, because that was the situation I was in with the first dog I had with a high pre-drive. I didn't know what to do and it was hard to get help. So that is that's my introduction in a
That,
nutshell.
and that is some introduction, Tracy. Welcome to Dog Speak, and thank you for taking the time to come speak to us today. Now, you, like most of us, will totally be aware of this recent study that was well, came out a week ago or a few weeks ago. And because of what you do for a living within the industry, did you manage to see the study and what were your take? What are your thoughts?
So yes, I did see the study. One of my group members shared it with me and said, "Oh, what do you think about this?" Because obviously I train with positive reinforcement, and they were saying this. Look, this study says that if we would use electric shock collars, we would get faster results. So then I had a look at the study. So my initial response was a great deal of disappointment, because not to do with the training method, that as well. But my first point of disappointment with that study was it was another focus on chase. And pre-driving dogs is more complicated than just chasing. So I was disappointed to see an article published in 2024 that had such a strong focus on chase behaviour, because I had hoped that we'd reached a point where researchers were acknowledging that there's a whole motor sequence involved and that chase is not the only part of it. And so to me, it felt like they went back many, many years. The focus, in my opinion, the focus was just poor. So I was disappointed because I was, oh, here's another article about chase. And why are we spending time and energy just focusing on that when it's a much more complicated series of events? And figuring out what to do when it causes problems for the dogs, for people with their dogs, is more complicated than just looking at, oh, what do we do if the dog's chasing something? So that was my initial, not this again. So then, anyway, I read the article and I did read it in a great deal of detail. And so there's been lots of debates about the ethics of it, and my firm opinion is that ethics doesn't get you all that far when talking about dog training. So I have never spoken to anybody who is doing something that they themselves think is unethical. Like, nobody. I've spoken to people who have never thought about it. They just do what they learn to do from somebody else, and they don't think any more deeply about it. There's plenty of people who are, and to be fair, like, why would you think more deeply about it if you don't know much about it? You go to your local dog trainer, they tell you what to do, you do it. Why would you think more deeply about it? But for dog trainers, we tend to think more deeply about it. And I've never met somebody who is doing something that they consider to be unethical. And whenever you would speak to the people, they will tell you that what they're doing is in the best interests, usually in the best interests of the dog. And that was certainly the case with that article. So the article, for anybody that hasn't read it, was a comparison of teaching dogs to recall from a chase. And they were just chasing like a lure. It was a plastic bag dragged along the ground lure type thing. And they were comparing if they used an electric shock collar at a fairly high setting with using food rewards. That was the comparison. And so, well, that's what they said they were testing. And that's like part of the problem is they didn't really test what they said they were testing. But that was the setup of the study, was to compare which dogs come back from chasing fastest. And the reason that people were contacting me and saying, oh, look at this, it says that an electric shock collar is more effective, is because in the study, yes, the electric shock collar stopped more. Well, what they did for positive reinforcement, to be frank, didn't stop any of the dogs from chasing, but the electric shock collar stopped most of them. So that's why the results are being cited the way they are, as this shows clearly that if you want to stop your dog chasing, you put an electric shock collar on it. And to be fair to the scientists, the reason that they had the shock collars set at a high level to start with was because there had been a previous study in 2014 similarly comparing, I think it was Lincoln University that did that one, and it was comparing using electric shock collars with using positive reinforcement. And one of the criticisms of that study is they started out with fairly low-level shocks. And there is some research that if you are going to use physical punishment to change the behavior of another being, then you need to go in at a high level. It needs to be like really startling so that they then never do the thing again. And there's an article somewhere online by Bob Bailey who had said, you know, to be frank, and he's a very famous animal trainer who did lots of training in the Second World War, training animals to do amazing things. And he had said, well, I wouldn't use any aversive experiences if I was just training for normal pet dog stuff. But if I did have to use an aversive experience when I was training the animals I was training, I went in at a high level to start with because I wanted to make sure that the animal wouldn't do it ever again. And there is research that backs that up, that that's more effective than starting at, you know, taking that kind of boiling a frog approach where you start at a low level and then you turn it up a bit and then you turn it up a bit and then you turn it up a bit, because some dogs will just habituate to even fairly high levels. So that's why they did that. They didn't go in at high levels because they wanted to be mean to the dogs. They did that to counter the criticisms of the earlier study that was similar to theirs. And what they did, so they found that it wasn't a very big study. They I think had like 19 dogs in total. Can't remember the exact numbers, but they started with 30. Some of the dogs would not reliably chase the lure, so they excluded them because obviously they were trying to test dogs who would chase. And then they split the dogs into three different groups, where they had the electric shock dogs. They had a group of dogs that were trained by positive reinforcement who encountered the lure moving at full speed to start with, and they had a group of dogs where the lure speed was slower, although they had trouble with that because when they ran the lure at lower speeds, what happened was the dogs just immediately caught it and destroyed it. So they did have trouble with that group. So that was their experiment. Now they found they had difficulties where they removed 2 of their shock collar dogs from that group, from the results, because they'd kind of set a limit for ethical reasons. They would have had to have gone to an ethics board. It was an American university. They would have had to have gone to an ethics board, and as part of getting ethics approval, they've said we won't shock the dogs more than 20 times. When they reviewed the video footage, they found that 2 of the dogs had been shocked more than 20 times to make them stop. So they just excluded those dogs, and the study didn't have a really good explanation. The only reason I know that is because one of the authors had posted about it on Facebook. But that information, in my opinion, should have been in the study, not like on social media. Those are things that are important to include. Um, so for me, when I looked at it, it it partly wasn't a good test because they had a couple of descriptions about how they were training an emergency recall with positive reinforcement. So they'd done some research, they'd referenced a couple of different methods for training an emergency recall, and then they didn't use any of them. They didn't use either of those methods. They did something that was completely different, that when I was reading it, I was like, well, I wouldn't, no wonder that didn't work. That was never going to work. So and I don't know why they did that. To me, that was like completely inexplicable. Why have references and then do something completely different? So they had no explanation about where they'd come up with the positive reinforcement protocol that they used. There was no explanation for where that actually came from. If I was cynical, I don't think they did do this because generally researchers are very attached to their research. I know I was, and you feel very emotionally attached to your research. So I would doubt very much if they would deliberately have done anything to sabotage their research. But if you were cynical, you would think they set that up deliberately like that so that the electric shock collar would appear to be more effective. I do not think for a minute that that's what they did, but it certainly leaves them open to that sort of criticism. And also it leaves them open to the criticism like this just wasn't a good test. It wasn't a good comparison because you're like one of your training methods clearly was set up. The trainers involved in the study are e-collar users and are familiar with training in that way. So that method was set up to go well, and the other method really wasn't. And that's not a criticism I would want in research that I was doing. Like to me, that's just a bad test. It's just like it's a waste of time doing bad tests. It's not just like they published it, but unless you're testing what you think you're testing, it's very difficult. And like I'm very sensitive to that not testing what you think you're testing thing because I have worked in IT for years and years and years. It was my entirely where my income came from for over 20 years. And now I work online and I do all my own tech stuff. So I keep my hand in because I just enjoy it. But key to IT is to making sure that when you set up a test for a system change that you're testing what you think you're testing. Because if you don't, it's not just that you write up an article and then people criticize it. If you don't, whatever you've done doesn't work properly and things go wrong in the world. And that's more of a problem. So I'm quite sensitive to this. It's no, like you're not really testing what you think you're testing. And that was very much the case with this study. And when they were allocating the dogs into groups, they said we randomly allocated the dogs into different groups. And they maybe did, perhaps they did. Randomly allocating, however, is not as easy as you think. And most researchers, when they randomly allocate, they say how they have randomly allocated. And the reason that they do that is because it's to let the readers determine for themselves, was this actually random? And like the reason that you need to make it random is because otherwise people do tend to self-sabotage. Not on purpose, but you tend to self-sabotage. So when I had a little look at the 3 groups of dog, so it turned out that the electric shock collar dogs were all younger. They were all adolescent dogs, 18 months old or younger. The dogs where they went in with the like full speed immediately, where the dogs in that group were the oldest, and the dogs in the other group were like slightly younger, but not as young as adolescent. So what that leaves, so the criticism that's left open there is you put all the older dogs with the most fixed chasing habits into the groups where you were going to use positive reinforcement, and you made sure that the oldest dogs were in the group where they would start off with the lure moving at full speed. Now that I don't think they did do that. I think it was probably just coincidence. And the study group was so small that those sorts of errors, like when when you do those sorts of allocations, it's easy for them to come in. But without the researchers saying, here is how we randomly allocated the dogs, it leaves them open to that sort of criticism that you not only did you sabotage the positive reinforcement training by like using a totally ludicrous training protocol, you also there was a secondary sabotage of it because you put all the dogs that were older with more established chasing habits in the group where you were going to use positive reinforcement. You put the younger, sensitive adolescent dogs where they feel things more. I've got an adolescent dog myself at the moment. They feel things more. They respond more to like minor things are a big deal to them. You put all of those younger dogs in the group where they were going to have an electric shock collar put on them. And they also, younger dogs, because less time has passed since they were born, will necessarily have less, habitual chasing. They just haven't had the time for it to develop. So the study just was like really flawed. The design was flawed. The reporting could have been clearer. Like, I was disappointed about what they were researching. I was disappointed about what they were researching to start with, and then I was really disappointed that the design was like, just had these massive holes in it, which I don't know how that happened, but that is like not what I would want to see in research. So those were really my thoughts about the study.
I mean, the way you've explained it, and in the last few weeks, I've heard people explain it in a very similar way.
Yes.
I can't pick between anyone that I've heard explaining it saying anything different to what you have just said. So the question I've got to ask is, it sounds like a big mess.
Mhm.
Where do we go with this mess? Because people are going to believe, some people are going to believe the study, because
Yeah.
that's human nature. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely,
And
100%. 100%. Some people will look at it and say, brilliant, my dog chases stuff and it's dangerous for them. They might run across a road, they might, get in a field of sheep. And even if they don't chase the sheep, even if all they're doing is chasing a deer through the field, that's a problem. I'd better get an electric shock collar. Yeah, and what's been particularly bad is most scientific studies that are published disappear without trace. And the only people that read them are academics who are doing some more research in the area, who read the existing research, or students who are studying for a degree because they have to cite them in their essays. And that's typically what happens to most scientific articles is nobody reads them or few people read them. But this one had such a lot of social media debate. I mean, I know it was really hard on the authors. I did email one of the authors and said, see, if you're thinking about researching in this area again, could I peer review? Could I look at the design? I don't necessarily wouldn't want the peer reviewers to be anonymous, because like that way you can kind of say what you like and there's no falling out. But I'd said, could I at least look at your design? Because the design was so flawed and it leaves you open to so much criticism. But the person I'd spoken to said, I don't know if I'll ever research in this area again because the experience has been so unpleasant. The backlash against it has been so unpleasant. I don't know if I will, but thanks for the offer. So I so I and to me that's what I would like to see going forward is better research. That's what I would like to see. But I fear that it's really unpredictable to know exactly what's going to come out of it because for everybody reading it and thinking, oh, this is the answer. I need to get an electric shock collar and put it on my dog. There are other people reading and saying, oh, but that's not very good, or they're reading other people's comments who are outlining the flaws, and they're just thinking, oh, that's not very good. And so it's perhaps in some ways it's making people lose confidence in all dog training. Maybe some people are losing confidence in all dog training. It's certainly, I mean, one of the things that came out of it, which really interested me, was all of the dogs that wore an electric shock collar were described as yelping in pain. Every single one of them. Now, so I don't often read through any more debates about electric shock collars, but I've been dog training dogs for a long time, and way back when I first started, I used to enjoy a good debate about training methods. And so persistently, and I know that this is still the case, persistently throughout the time I've been involved in dog training, one of the arguments has always been, but the shock collar doesn't hurt the dog, it just gets their attention. Now, this article has made it very clear that that's not the case. And because the argument often is, well, with inexperienced shock collar users, then that might be the case that the dogs are caused pain, but with experienced collar users, there is no pain. And the article has made it like very, very clear that that's not the case, particularly because like one of the trainers is very high profile. He has got a lot of success in training dogs and in dog sports. So to suggest that he is an inexperienced trainer is just ludicrous. That guy's like trained, he's probably trained more dogs than I've seen. He really knows what he's doing. He's got so much success. So you can't anymore, like, having that article in the World means that argument is is gone. You can't anymore say, well, the dogs only feel pain if somebody who doesn't know what they're doing is using the collar. That's clear that in the hands of somebody experienced, if you're using an electric shock collar to deal with chasing, then you're going to have to cause the dog enough sufficient pain that they are yelping in pain. And and to me, that makes it really uncertain where, like, what, if any, fallout there will be from this. But yeah, it is interesting because it's just had so much attention. You don't, like, normally scientific research disappears without a trace.
It's quite sad in many ways because we do hear, I've certainly heard, where trainers have said if it's used by an experienced person, then it works better. Well, my question to that would be, it doesn't need someone to be experienced to cause pain.
No, it's true. It's true. It doesn't. It really doesn't. And I guess the article, which would really make me hesitate to draw conclusions, is so what they found was when the dogs chased a lure, like a kind of, I'm assuming a plastic bag type lure because that's what they often use in lure coursing events. They had a fairly high success rate. Now, when they did a final test of the training, what they did was they moved their lure course to a different area of the training facility. So it was still like in what would be obviously a dog training area. And now this is significant because people and dogs, in my experience, recognize a training situation when if they've got any experience, they recognize, and they will often behave differently in a class setting than they do out on a walk. It's very common. So what they did was they moved to a different part of the facility, but they're still within a training facility. They then replaced the plastic bag lure with a soft toy, and the success rate dropped. With the shock collar, the success rate dropped immediately. Now, like, it's training a dog to stop chasing a soft toy on a lure in a sterile environment is one thing. But for most people, having problems with their dog around prey are not, that's nothing like what's causing them problems. Most of the time, many people have problems because the dog knows that there's prey there before they do and is gone. Like if you're standing there and you can see your dog chasing something, especially if your setup is you start standing still, you can clearly see the thing before it moves. And then when it starts moving, you've got an opportunity to call your dog. That setup is like the Rolls Royce of training setups. And that's nothing like what the real world presents you with. What most people find in the real world is they are out trying to train their dog. They a bird swoops in front of them that they weren't even aware was there. In fact, yesterday I took my young puppy out to do some loose lead walking training. As we stepped outside the front door, two crows in the tree next to my house were having a fight, and one of them fell out of the tree, swooped really low to get back into the air right in front of his nose. Now that's the sort of thing that happens in the real world. And also for many dogs, the wind direction may be that they catch the scent of the prey long before they see it. Their arousal is up and that means that any training is going to be more difficult. And one of the things with pain is if arousal's high, if adrenaline particularly levels are high, pain is deadened. That's one of the functions of adrenaline, is it's an extremely effective painkiller. And that is why like dogs will run through invisible electric fencing when they're chasing something because they don't really feel it because of the adrenaline, but then they won't necessarily come back through when they're a bit calmer and whatever it is has been chased. Then it won't necessarily return back through the fence because their adrenaline levels are lower and they would feel the shock and they're aware of that. So there's plenty of people with dogs who have been still running while injured. It's not uncommon with like working spaniels for them to work to the point of exhaustion because their adrenaline's so high that they just don't feel it. So that's one of the issues that people face out in the real world is sometimes at the point they realize there's an issue, the dog's arousal is so high that they wouldn't register the shock in the same way as they would if you've got this kind of sterile setup, which there was in the experiment. So to me, and the fact that just changing location and using a soft toy instead of a lure caused a couple of the dogs to then ignore the recall cue, it absolutely backs that up. So it is a worry to me that people would envisage that if they copied that protocol, they could then take their dog out and the dog would respond to them anywhere, because that's the issue. Is the whole prey thing is it doesn't happen in a sterile environment like that. It happens in the world, and there's a lot of factors at play.
And that is quite worrying.
That would worry me, yes.
Yeah. It brings me back to thinking, those that do believe in this study and go and practice as best as they can, what they envisage to be the setup, the criteria, the setup, etc., etc. So I'm going to be heading for a downfall.
Yes, and it's not uncommon because there are no guarantees in dog training. This is like one of the issues, is there are no guarantees. So there are plenty of dogs that have been hit by cars while chasing something while wearing an electric shock collar. It's not uncommon, and there's plenty of people I see like videos floating around all over the place where the dogs has been e-collar trained and they still can't let the dog off a line because the dog will still go off after wildlife or whatever. And they've learned that because they've had the dog off lead. The dog's disappeared off after a deer or something. So this is the whole problem, is there are no, it's not a problem. It's just a reality of the world. There are no guarantees. There are no guarantees with anything. And even a perfectly obedient dog doesn't fix the problem. So I'm used to working with perfectly obedient computers. I spend quite a bit of my time still doing that. I work with perfectly obedient computers. So and when I worked in a commercial IT where I had people telling me what to do, one of the common questions that I would be asked is, when you make this change to the live system, can you guarantee that we won't have any problems? And I would always say, no, definitely not. And people would get really upset. I mean, it's a hard message to hear. So my experience was I'd deliver that message to the first person that asked me. They would go and try and tell their boss that, and the boss wouldn't be happy. So the boss would phone me and I'd tell the boss the same thing. And then that boss would go and tell their boss, who also wouldn't be happy. And sometimes I was speaking to people in like fairly senior positions in the billion-dollar company that I was doing this work for, who would increasingly be saying, but we need a guarantee, Tracey. This is very, very important. We need a guarantee. And I was like, well, we can't. Don't make the change. Don't make the change to the system, but also like don't imagine that not making changes makes things safer, because sometimes you do need to make changes to make things safer. But there's risk either way. There's risk in doing training. There's risk in not doing training. There's risk all over the place, and there are no guarantees. And that's just a feature of life for all of
Yeah.
us. But I know that it's a really hard message, and what people like myself included want is a guarantee. I want to know when I go out with my dog that my dog is going to be safe, and I want that to be guaranteed. And that's what everybody wants. And that's why these sorts of studies I think are so compelling, because it looks like, you can have a certainly depending on how people report their reading of that study, it could potentially look like a guarantee, even though like if you read the study, it's nothing like if you can read, but that's the difficulty with that sort of scientific research, is like there's a literacy involved in, like it's a peculiar writing style. It's a very weird writing style. It's not easy to read. And unless like for people that haven't like been shown how to read those sorts of studies, sometimes they're very difficult to understand. I consider it to be like a really poor writing style because of that. Um, but that's part of the issue with scientific studies, is it's easy to read them and not really understand what they were on about. Like there's some I read where I'm just like, I don't understand really what you did here when you got to your statistic, when you got to analysing the data you gathered. I didn't really understand what it was that you did. And that's common. So for like normal people like us, then it's very difficult and dependent. And people often don't read the whole study, they just like read the headline of it and then report their opinion based on that. That's very, very common. And if you just look at that, it could look like, well, you need to use an electric shock collar if you've got a dog that chases stuff.
You, you've actually just made me think about something else, because when it hit social media, I would probably say that a higher percentage of people were trainers that would have seen this first. Okay.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. In a couple of days, a few days down the line, as it's going around social media, um, members of the public that are not dog trainers will also have seen this study. And the frightening thing for me is that someone who doesn't really understand the complexity of dog, the training of dogs, or how we train dogs, I should say, will believe that is the best thing to do, is go order your electric shock collar off of Amazon, and it's going to do all these things that this study says it should do. It's guaranteed. Yeah.
Yes. Well,
And
yes, because that's what
yeah,
you would think.
absolutely. But someone like yourself who understood the study could break it down, analyze it, and give it back to someone like myself and say, this is how it went, this is what they did, this is what they didn't do. Yeah. Would understand. But the member of the public, what I'm trying to say here is Are we going to see more people using electric collars?
Possibly, possibly. Well, because the other thing that this study included was they also did some looking at the welfare of the dogs. They did some cortisol level testing, and they said that the dogs with the electric shock collars didn't show any, like, they had no welfare concerns. But again, this is like, it's so narrow. So recently, just to put it in context, quite recently, I took one of my spaniels to a workshop for working tests for spaniels. And often, not always, but the gun dog training area of dog training has a reputation for using harder methods than I would use. And certainly the lovely man running the workshop, who was great. I mean, he was so kind and so generous with his time. And like they all were, the club that put it together had, like, I think almost every official in their club there helping us on this day learning. They were so generous because it was very inexpensive and they were very generous with their time. But when I was watching the person teaching the workshop working with some of the other dogs, he was handling them in ways that I didn't want my dog being handled. So when it was my turn, I said, "Oh, I don't want you to like correct my dog at all. And, like, in fact, just don't touch her." And so so some people heard me like, or there were people there that I knew who were like, "Oh, I hope he doesn't do anything to Tracy's dog," and he so people were a bit concerned that she might bite him, and that wasn't my concern. But what I was concerned about was what I said to him was, what I don't want to happen is that you frighten her. I said she's quite a sensitive dog, and I don't want you to frighten her because I live alone with my dogs, and they spend less time therefore with men. And if you frighten her, what I don't want happening down the line is she develops a fear of unknown men, because I'd said, I take her to coffee shops with me. I will go for walks with her like a normal dog with my sister, and we walk to a coffee shop, and then we sit there with her on my knee often. And she's a very small spaniel. She often sits on my knee, and I said, what I don't want is her starting to growl or try to bite male waiting staff that come over to us. And, my sister's got 4 boys, 3 of whom are now older teenagers. And I said, and I don't want to be at my sister's house, and one of like my nephew's friends strolls in through the door, as they often do, to get something out the kitchen. And she flies across the room and attacks them. I don't want anything like that happening. So I don't want you to touch my dog, because I'm worried about the knock-on impact if he had done something that scared her. And I'm pretty sure that he could have handled her in the way he was handling some of the other dogs, and there would be no ill effects shown at that time. I mean, I would pretty much guarantee it, because the training was taking place on a shooting estate in Scotland with about 1 million pheasants on it. And so he probably, like, if he had done something to her, I think in that moment she would have shrugged it off, because there was so much exciting scent around, and she would have shrugged it off, focused on the scent, not being all that bothered. But that then it may be that she then went somewhere else that's more boring for her, like a coffee shop or my sister's living room. She may well then have gone, do you know what? An unknown man was really horrible to me, and so I am going to make sure that that never happens again. And so that's the issue, partly, as well as with those sorts of looking in the moment at like stress levels. And so I think they looked at body language as well. They spent quite a lot of time on that, on looking at that. But to me, that's not what I would be worried. What I'd be worried about is what happens 2 weeks down the line. What happens a month later when a visitor comes to your house when you don't normally have visitors? What's happening then, when you've had your dog, like, in a situation where there's been a trainer, and suddenly a whole lot of pain? What happens down the line the next time there's a stranger near your dog, or the next time you go to a new dog training class or a new workshop and the trainer looks a bit like that guy? What happens then? That's more my concern than the immediate welfare, because a lot of dogs just appear to shrug things off. in the moment. And that was why I had a chat with that gun dog trainer to make sure that he was aware of how I live with my dog and how concerned I would be if she became fearful of strange men. And he was great. He was so lovely. He just said, "Can I just give her a cuddle then? Do you think that would be okay?" And I said, "Yes, that would be fine." And then I think as well, he spoke to some of the other men there because she had quite a lot of cuddles that day, from these lovely people who were there helping us learn about what they need to do to compete in working tests, which was great. It was a very nice day. But my concern was not what will happen in this moment. My concern was what will happen down the line, and that and it's hard to include that information in a study. It's really, you run out, these are costly things to do, and to generate enough funding for that is hard. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I
That's
totally agree with you. Is it not important that trainers, we should be thinking about the emotional experience of every dog?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. We should be
because
considering their emotional experience, and that's the other limitation of the welfare in that study is. So prey drive's very bound up with welfare for dogs. It's a natural innate behaviour for dogs, and actually, in many ways, it's been highly strength parts of it have been highly strengthened in specific breeds. That's why I can get a Cocker Spaniel puppy, which I did do, who had initially no interest in following scent, and say, "Oh, it's fine when he's a bit older, that'll just appear," which it has. Because, and I could say that with a great deal of confidence because he's a Cocker Spaniel and that's what they're bred to do. So so for the dogs, it's innate behaviour, and like one of the five freedoms, the welfare five freedoms, is freedom to do natural behaviour. So, and those are fairly old. Welfare measures in the last 30 years have kind of moved on from the five freedoms, which is just about, they're really just about preventing suffering. Researchers looking into welfare now are looking at how to give the animals a good life. So research now would be far on from that. But this study, we're not considering the welfare beyond their cortisol levels and their body language in the moment. We're not considering their welfare at all. We're considering stopping them performing what is innate behaviour, and that's the whole focus. And really, there are huge welfare implications with that as well. If there's no replacement for it, I'm not suggesting we all just take our dogs out and let them chase whatever they want and decimate the wildlife population where they live. Not suggesting we do that, but we do need to be aware of the dog's innate behavior patterns and figure out ways to let them perform those sorts of behaviors in the same way as zoos increasingly come up with creative ways to feed their predators that are more they don't put a prey animal just in with them, but they increasingly come up with creative ways to provide food for their predators that at least give them outlets for those natural behavior patterns that otherwise they don't have. And they do that because if they don't do it, the welfare of the animal suffers. And it's the same with dogs. So it's not enough to just say, well, chasing things is dangerous, so we're going to stop them chasing things. There's more to welfare than just preventing your dog from getting injured chasing a rabbit across a road. There's more to welfare than that.
Tracy, we're going to end it there. That's been absolutely fabulous the way you put that out and it explained it. Um, there's a lot more we could discuss about
Oh,
this study,
yeah.
not just about the study, about the emotional welfare of dogs,
Mm-hmm.
experiences.
Yep.
And if we are ever going to cut out using aversive technique, now I know anything can be aversive. There are purposeful aversive techniques that some people use, purposely to hurt and harm the dog. Yeah? Which we can discuss on another podcast. I just want to say, Tracy, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and anyone watching this is going to really enjoy it. But if they want to make contact with you, Tracy, how would they find you?
So my website is basedoglearningandstuff.co.uk. If they Google my name, it comes up. So if they Google my name, and yeah, that's the best. My website's the best place. There's loads of resources on it to help people with prey drive because it's like the only thing that I work with. So there's loads of resources on my website that people can access. So that's the best place.
Tracy, once again, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on today. I will be looking to have you back very soon. Um, that's it from Dog Speak, folks. So until the next time, be good, stay safe, and treat your dogs with all the love you possibly can in the world. Bye for now.